Picture this. Dawn breaks over an endless plain and mist rises from the earth like breath from sleeping giants. The air is cool, still untouched by the coming heat of day. Beneath your feet, though you cannot see it, lie the compressed memories of 10,000 years. Stones that once formed walls. Hearths that once warmed children. Streets where merchants once called out their wares in languages no living ear would recognize. This is the quiet truth of our world, that history is not a clean, well-lit corridor stretching back to some obvious beginning. It is a labyrinth of half-remembered rooms, most of them locked, many of them flooded or buried, and some perhaps the most important completely erased from the map. The civilizations we celebrate in textbooks, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, these were not humanity's first attempts at complexity. They were merely the first attempts that left enough ruins behind to be noticed. Before them, in the soft blur of prehistory, other societies rose and fell, so gently that their passing barely left a scar. No apocalyptic fires, no invading armies. Just a slow fade, like music drifting away across water until you can no longer be certain you heard anything at all. Contemporary archaeology whispers something unsettling, that the timeline we've constructed is full of gaps. Not empty spaces, necessarily, but compression zones where centuries seem to vanish without explanation. Sites are dated, artifacts cataloged, and then silence. The people simply moved on, or melted back into the land, or transformed so completely that their descendants forgot they had ever been anything else. This is not a story of catastrophe. It is a story of departure, of civilizations that chose, or were compelled, to become something different. Communities that followed the rains when the rains moved on. Builders who abandoned their temples not in defeat, but in acceptance. Mariners who sailed away from drying harbors and never looked back. Somewhere beneath the Sahara's endless dunes, there are cities that have not seen sunlight for 6,000 years. In the Persian Gulf, beneath 30 meters of saltwater, lie the drowned campfires of fisherfolk who watch the ocean swallow their world one tide at a time. On hillsides from Turkey to Thailand, stones still carry the fingerprints of people whose names we will never know. These are the gentle ghosts of history, the ones who left without explanation, the ones who built wonders and walked away, the ones whose greatest monuments are not pyramids or temples, but the simple, staggering fact that they existed at all and that we almost forgot them completely. For most of human existence, we lived lightly on the earth, not because we were primitives stumbling through the darkness, but because we were nomads brilliant, adaptable, and unburdened by the weight of permanent things. The archaeological record from this period is sparse, not because these people left nothing behind, but because what they left was never meant to last. Wood rots, leather decays. Even bone, given enough time and weather, returns to dust. But occasionally, something survives. A cache of ochre, buried with ritual care. A pendant carved from mammoth ivory. A child's footprint preserved in volcanic ash, still visible 40,000 years after the child ran laughing toward a horizon we can only imagine. The mainstream narrative places the birth of civilization somewhere around 10 to 12,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, where wild grains grew thick and game was plentiful. Here, the story goes, humans made the great leap, from wandering hunter-gatherers to settled farmers, from temporary camps to permanent villages, from oral traditions to writing, from tribes to empires. It's a compelling narrative. It's also increasingly incomplete. Recent discoveries have begun to crack the neat chronology. Sophisticated tools appear in layers of earth dated to periods when such sophistication shouldn't exist. Astronomical knowledge shows up in societies that supposedly lacked the leisure time or social complexity to develop it. Architectural achievements emerge from cultures that were, according to the textbooks, still learning to farm. Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey is perhaps the most famous example, a massive stone temple complex constructed by people who, theoretically, hadn't yet invented agriculture. The pillars are carved with intricate reliefs of animals: serpents, foxes, birds of prey. The stones weigh up to 20 tons each, quarried from bedrock and transported to hilltops by methods we can only speculate about. And then, after centuries of use, the entire site was deliberately buried, filled in, hidden, preserved beneath tons of earth as if waiting for a future generation to rediscover it. Why would a society invest generations of labor into a monument, only to erase it? The question hangs in the air like incense in an empty church. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Across the world, in regions with no apparent contact, similar anachronisms appear. Stone circles in Africa dated to periods before metalworking. Megalithic structures in Indonesia that suggest organizational capabilities far beyond what tribal societies were supposed to possess. Rock art in Australia, depicting animals that went extinct thousands of years before humans were thought to have reached the continent. Each discovery is explained away, fitted somehow into the existing framework. And yet the framework itself begins to feel strained, like a theory stretched too thin. Archaeologists speak carefully, aware that speculation can damage reputations. But in quieter moments, many will admit, there are gaps in our understanding, jumps in complexity that feel less like gradual evolution and more like sudden emergence. Perhaps we are not the first humans to organize, to build, to wonder about the stars. Perhaps we are merely the first humans to do so in a way that left ruins durable enough to survive the relentless grinding of geological time. Before us, in the midst of prehistory, there may have been others equally curious, equally ambitious, whose monuments were made of wood or clay or song. Long before the pyramids rose above the Nile, long before ziggurats towered over Mesopotamian plains, there were other builders. People whose names we will never know, who spoke languages that left no descendants, who carved stone with tools we have not yet learned to recognize. They worked in the twilight hours of human history, at the end of the Ice Age, when the world was transforming from a frozen wilderness into something warmer, wetter, and far more hospitable. The Ice Age's end was not a single event, but a series of climate pulses, each one reshaping coastlines, flooding valleys, and turning deserts into grasslands. As glaciers retreated, they exposed land that had been locked beneath ice for millennia. Rivers that had been frozen solid became rushing torrents. Seas rose, swallowing entire landscapes and forcing coastal populations to flee inland or adapt in ways we can barely imagine. In this liminal period, roughly 12 to 14,000 years ago, something extraordinary began to happen. Human societies that had survived on mobility for tens of thousands of years started to experiment with permanence. Not farming yet, not quite, but semi-permanent settlements built around abundant wild resources. Clusters of circular stone structures, communal hearths, storage pits filled with grain collected from wild grasses. These were the first architects in the truest sense. Not simply arranging found materials into crude shelters, but quarrying, shaping, and engineering stone into forms that would outlast generations. The megaliths of this era found, scattered across Europe, Africa, and Asia, are not random markers. They align with solstices, equinoxes, and stellar events. They form patterns that suggest not isolated communities, but networks of shared knowledge, pilgrimage routes that connected distant peoples in ways we're only beginning to understand. Göbekli Tepe stands as the most famous exemplar, but it was not unique. Across the Anatolian plateau, similar sites have emerged from excavation. Karahan Tepe, Nevali Kori, Harbutsuvan Tepesi. Each one features massive T-shaped pillars, elaborate carvings, and evidence of ritual feasting on a scale that required coordination across multiple groups. These were not villages in the conventional sense. They were ceremonial centers, built and maintained by societies organized enough to feed and house hundreds of laborers over decades. And yet, these builders left no written records. No king lists, no administrative tablets, no inscriptions boasting of their achievements. Their history is silent, readable only in stone and bone and charcoal. What motivated them? Why dedicate so much energy to structures that serve no obvious survival function? The mainstream explanation invokes religion, the universal impulse to honor the divine, to create sacred space, to mark the boundary between the profane and the holy. But this answer, while satisfying, is also incomplete. Religion does not exist in a vacuum. It emerges from social complexity, from surplus resources, from leisure time, from, in other words, the very conditions that these sites themselves represent. There is another possibility, rarely voiced in academic literature, but whispered among those who study these places closely, that the builders of the Dawn Age were not the first, that they inherited knowledge, techniques, perhaps even half-ruined monuments from predecessors we have not yet found, that the skills displayed at Göbekli Tepe precision quarrying, astronomical alignment, symbolic art were not invented from scratch, but refined from older traditions now lost beneath sea level rise, glacial rebound, or the slow burial of sediment. If this is true, and it remains speculation, tantalizing but unproven, then human civilization is far older than our textbooks admit. The Dawn Age builders were not pioneers, but inheritors, caretakers of wisdom passed down through oral traditions stretching back into the frozen darkness of the Pleistocene. In the Orkney Islands, off the northern coast of Scotland, there is a place called Skara Brae. It is one of Europe's best-preserved Neolithic villages, a cluster of stone houses buried beneath sand dunes for over 4,000 years. When storms exposed it in the 19th century, archaeologists found something unsettling. The village had been abandoned suddenly, but not violently. Beds were still furnished with stone slabs and heather mattresses. Stone dressers held beads and tools. Hearths contained ash from fires that had burned out centuries before the Roman Empire existed. But the people, all of them, were gone. There was no sign of warfare, no bodies buried in rubble, no fire damage or structural collapse. The inhabitants simply left, perhaps in a hurry, perhaps with deliberation. They walked away from homes they had occupied for generations, leaving behind everything but the essentials. And they never came back. Skara Brae is not unique. Across the ancient world, similar stories repeat. Catalyük in Turkey, a sprawling settlement of interconnected houses, was abandoned around 5,700 BCE after nearly 2,000 years of continuous habitation. The reasons remain unclear. There is no evidence of famine, disease, or invasion. The people simply departed, and the empty buildings slowly collapsed into themselves, layer by layer, until the entire site was buried beneath its own ruins. In the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built magnificent cliff dwellings, multi-story stone cities tucked into canyon walls, accessible only by ladder or rope. Around 1300 CE, after centuries of occupation, they were abandoned. Pottery left mid-creation, corn stored in sealed rooms. The inhabitants migrated elsewhere, perhaps driven by drought, perhaps by social upheaval, perhaps by reasons we will never fully comprehend. These are the ghost villages of prehistory. Not destroyed, but departed. Not conquered, but simply vacated. They remind us that the end of a civilization need not be dramatic. There need be no conquering army, no earthquake, no plague. Sometimes a culture simply decides collectively, mysteriously, that it is time to move on. And the silence they leave behind is more haunting than any battlefield. Today, the Sahara is the world's largest hot desert, a sea of sand and stone stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, hostile to almost all forms of life. It is a place of extremes, temperatures that soar past 50 degrees Celsius by day and plunge below freezing at night. A landscape so barren that astronauts use it to simulate the surface of Mars. But 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. Not metaphorically green, not partially green, but profoundly, extravagantly green. Savannas thick with acacia and grasses. Forests of cypress and oak. Rivers wide enough to support hippos and crocodiles. Lakes so vast they would dwarf any body of freshwater in Africa today. Rainfall that came in monsoons, drenching the land from June to September, filling aquifers that fed springs for thousands of years afterward. This was the African humid period, a climatic epoch that lasted roughly from 14,000 to 5,000 years ago. It was driven by orbital mechanics' subtle shifts in Earth's axial tilt and precession that intensified the West African monsoon. As the northern hemisphere tilted more directly toward the sun during summer, warm air rose over the Sahara, drawing moisture-laden winds from the Atlantic deep into the continental interior. The result was an ecological transformation so complete that it feels almost mythological. Elephants roamed where sand dunes now stand. Giraffes grazed on trees that are now fossilized stumps buried beneath 30 meters of sand. Fish swam in rivers whose dry beds are visible today only from satellite imagery. And humans thrived. Tens of thousands of them, perhaps hundreds of thousands, living in villages along lake shores, fishing with bone hooks, hunting with microliths, and critically beginning to domesticate cattle. This was not a handful of nomadic bands scratching out survival. This was a civilization in embryo, a cultural fluorescence spread across a landscape larger than the continental United States. Rock art from this period covers cliff faces throughout the Sahara. Detailed, sophisticated paintings depicting pastoral life, herds of cattle, women churning milk, men in elaborate headdresses. The art is not crude or primitive. It shows mastery of perspective, anatomy, and narrative composition. Some paintings include what appear to be ceremonial dances or religious rituals, figures moving in coordinated patterns around central symbols that remain inscrutable. But the archaeological record is frustratingly incomplete. Most of the Green Sahara settlements are now buried beneath dunes or eroded by winds that have scoured the landscape for millennia. What we have found: potsherds, grinding stones, bone harpoons hints at complex societies, but the full story remains hidden. We do not know what languages these people spoke. We do not know how they organized their societies. We do not know if they had kings, councils, shamans, or something entirely different. What we do know is that when the rains failed gradually, over centuries, as orbital mechanics shifted again, these cultures did not simply vanish, they adapted. Some migrated south, following the rains into sub-Saharan Africa. Some moved east toward the Nile Valley, carrying with them traditions of cattle herding and megalithic construction that would influence Egyptian civilization. And some perhaps stayed too long, watching their lakes shrink year by year, their grasslands turn to dust, their herds dwindle, hoping the rains would return, hoping the world would become green again. It never did, and the Sahara swallowed their memory as completely as it swallowed their cities. Among the vanished waters of the Green Sahara, one stands out for sheer scale: Lake Mega Chad. At its peak, around 6,000 years ago, it covered an area larger than the Caspian Sea, roughly 400,000 square kilometers of freshwater stretching across what is now Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. It was fed by rivers flowing from the Central African highlands, and its shores supported ecosystems rich enough to sustain megafauna. Elephants, rhinos, and aquatic mammals now found only hundreds of kilometers to the south. Modern Lake Chad, by comparison, is a puddle. For the people who lived around Lake Mega Chad, life would have been abundant. Fish migrated through extensive wetlands. Birds nested in reeds along the shallows. Hippos wallowed in the deeper channels. The lake moderated temperatures, creating a microclimate that extended the range of tropical species northward and Mediterranean species southward. It was, in short, an Eden. Archaeological evidence suggests that these shorelines were densely populated. Pottery styles found in excavations around the lake's former extent show remarkable consistency, hinting at a shared culture or trade network spanning hundreds of kilometers. Bone harpoons, intricately carved and often decorated, indicate sophisticated fishing technology. Grinding stones suggest the processing of wild grains and possibly early experimentation with cultivation. But here's the mystery. Despite decades of research, no large settlements have been found, no monumental architecture, no ceremonial centers comparable to those emerging elsewhere in the Neolithic world. The people of Lake Megachad left behind tools and potsherds, yes, but no cities, no temples, no obvious hierarchies. Why? One possibility is that their settlements were made of organic materials, wood, reeds, animal hides that decomposed completely in the tropical climate. Another is that their social structures simply didn't favor permanent monuments. Perhaps they were philosophically opposed to centralization, preferring instead a distributed network of autonomous communities linked by kinship and trade. Or perhaps, and this is pure speculation, their greatest monuments lie beneath the lake itself. Lake Chad's water level has fluctuated dramatically over millennia, rising and falling with climate cycles. During drier periods, the lake would have shrunk, exposing vast mudflats and former lake beds. If major settlements were built on these exposed areas during low water phases, they would now be submerged, buried beneath meters of sediment, invisible to conventional archaeology. Imagine a city built on pilings, stilts driven deep into lake mud, houses clustered around communal platforms. Imagine canals carved through marshland, connecting neighborhoods like aquatic streets. Imagine seasonal festivals where thousands gathered on floating rafts to celebrate the fish migrations, the bird arrivals, the turning of the year. All of it gone, dissolved into the sediment, leaving behind only whispers, faint traces in soil chemistry, anomalies in sonar scans, oral traditions passed down through generations of Saharan herders who speak of cities beneath the sand where water once flowed. The ghosts of Lake Megachad are patient. They have waited 6,000 years already. Perhaps in another 6,000, when the climate shifts again and the rains return, the lake will rise and reveal what it has kept hidden. Until then, we are left with fragments, whispers, the strange, unsettling feeling that something vast and intricate existed here, and we have barely begun to understand it. Deep in the Sahara, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest ocean, carved into rock faces weathered by millennia of sandstorms, there are images of boats. Not crude symbolic shapes, but detailed, recognizable vessels. Some show multiple rowers, oars extended in precise rhythm. Others depict sails billowing in invisible winds. One particularly striking example, found in the Tassili Niger Plateau in Algeria, shows a large ceremonial barge with a high prow and stern, reminiscent of Egyptian Nile boats, but predating the pyramids by thousands of years. The presence of these engravings poses an obvious question. Why would people living in what was then savanna and is now desert carve images of boats? The mainstream explanation is straightforward. These carvings date to the African humid period, when the Sahara was crossed by rivers and dotted with lakes. Boats would have been essential for fishing, transportation, and trade. The engravings are simply documentary, a record of daily life preserved in stone. But some carvings trouble this simple narrative. They appear on hilltops far from any known ancient watercourse. They depict vessels too large for river use, with designs that suggest open water navigation rather than inland fishing. And they cluster in regions where no archaeological evidence of permanent water has been found, areas that, even during the wettest phases of the Holocene, would have been marginal at best. Could these images represent something else? Memory, perhaps. Traditions carried by migrants who traveled from distant coasts, bringing with them stories and symbols of maritime life. Or perhaps they represent ritual boats as vehicles for spiritual journeys, as ferries for the dead, as metaphors for transitions between worlds. There is another possibility, more speculative but intriguing, that the Green Sahara supported a genuinely maritime culture, one that navigated not rivers and lakes, but ephemeral seas. During intense monsoon periods, vast areas of the Sahara would have flooded, creating temporary bodies of water that persisted for months at a time. These seasonal seas would have required boats for access, and communities might have specialized in navigating them, following the floodwaters, fishing and trading, then moving on when the waters receded. Such a culture would leave little trace. Temporary settlements built on higher ground, dismantled and rebuilt each season. Boats constructed from reeds or hides, which decompose quickly in desert conditions. No permanent infrastructure, no monumental architecture, just movement, adaptation, and an intimate knowledge of water's rhythms. Evidence for long-distance trade networks supports this hypothesis. Shells from the Mediterranean and Red Sea have been found in Saharan sites hundreds of kilometers inland. Obsidian from volcanic sources in the Tibesti Mountains appears in settlements on the Sahara as northern and southern fringes. These materials had to be transported somehow, across vast distances, through landscapes that were challenging even during humid periods. Perhaps the answer lies in boats. Not just river vessels, but seaworthy craft capable of navigating the Sahara's ephemeral waterways, the desert seas, that existed for a few precious millennia before the rain stopped and the sand returned. Today, those routes are invisible, buried beneath dunes, eroded by winds, transformed beyond recognition. But the carvings remain, silent witnesses to a way of life we can barely imagine. Mariners of the desert seas, their stories etched in stone, waiting for us to learn their language. In 1969, archaeologists working in the Tanur Desert, one of the most inhospitable regions of the Sahara, discovered something extraordinary. Half buried in sand, exposed by wind erosion, lay the skeleton of a young woman. She had been carefully buried, her body positioned with deliberation, accompanied by grave goods that spoke of care and ritual. Around her neck was a necklace, not of bone or stone, but of marine shells. Cowrie shells, specifically, glossy and unmistakable, the kind found on tropical coastlines in shallow waters where waves lap against coral reefs. The nearest coastline was more than 1,500 kilometers away. Radiocarbon dating placed her death at approximately 9,000 years ago, during the height of the African humid period. The Tanur, at that time, would have been semi-arid grassland rather than pure desert, but it was still far inland, isolated from any ocean. The shells around her neck represented something profound: connection. Someone had traveled immense distances, either to obtain these shells or to trade for them. The shells had value enough to be worn, cherished, buried with the dead. They were not functional. They served no practical purpose. They were beautiful, rare, and utterly foreign to the landscape in which this woman lived and died. Who was she? A trader herself, perhaps, who had journeyed to distant coasts and returned with treasures. Or the recipient of a gift, as shells passed hand to hand across hundreds of kilometers through networks of exchange that spanned the Green Sahara. Or a priestess, a healer, someone whose status warranted burial with objects of power and prestige. We will never know her name. We will never hear her voice or learn what she thought when she looked at the stars above the Tanur night. But we know this: she was connected to people, to places, to a world far larger than her immediate surroundings. The shells around her neck prove it, and she is not alone. Across the Sahara, similar discoveries have emerged: marine shells in inland graves, obsidian tools hundreds of kilometers from volcanic sources, pottery styles that appear simultaneously in regions separated by deserts and mountains. Each find whispers the same truth: the ancient Sahara was not a barrier, but a crossroads, a landscape threaded with invisible roots that connected distant peoples in ways we are only beginning to understand. The woman of the tenor sleeps again now, reburied to protect her remains from looters and erosion. But her necklace, carefully documented, photographed, preserved, remains as evidence. Proof that even in prehistory, even in the harshest landscapes, humans were never truly isolated. We have always been travelers, always been traders, always been seekers, reaching across impossible distances for connection, beauty, and the stories that seashells can tell. The names Zargian and Eterian belong to archaeological cultures, not peoples. They are labels applied to tool assemblages and living patterns observed in the archaeological record shorthand for societies, whose real names, languages, and self-identities are lost forever. The Eterian culture flourished in North Africa, roughly 145,000 to 20,000 years ago, a staggering span of time during which climate oscillated between humid and arid phases. Eterian peoples were sophisticated tool makers, known for their distinctive tanged projectile point stone arrowheads, or spear tips with narrow stems designed for hafting to wooden shafts. These tools required advanced planning and skill, and their presence across a vast geographic range suggests either widespread cultural exchange or a single highly mobile population. What makes the Eterian truly intriguing is their survival through multiple environmental catastrophes. Sea level rise, glacial advance, and the hyper-arid phase that nearly emptied the Sahara around 70,000 years ago. Each of these events should have fragmented and scattered human populations. Yet Eterian tool traditions persist, reappearing in the record after each crisis, suggesting resilience and adaptability that rival any modern society. Did some Eterian groups develop proto-urban settlements during humid phases? Did they construct shelters complex enough to weather the dry periods, perhaps in oases or mountain refugia where water persisted? The evidence is tantalizing but inconclusive. Shell beads, ochre pigments, and decorative objects appear in Eterian sites, hinting at symbolic thought and social complexity. But no monumental architecture has been found, no grand ruins beneath the Sahara to rival Göbekli Tepe or the megaliths of Europe. Perhaps they built in wood or wattle and daub, materials that decompose completely in desert environments. Perhaps their monuments were oral traditions, epic poems, origin stories, genealogies recited across generations, carrying knowledge forward without need for stone or script. Or perhaps, in their worldview, permanence was not a virtue. Perhaps they understood, better than we do, that the only constant is change. The Zargian culture, active roughly 18,000 to 8,000 years ago in the Zagros Mountains and surrounding regions, tells a parallel story. Zargian peoples lived in caves and rock shelters, hunting wild goats and gazelles, collecting wild cereals and nuts. They made geometric microlith steini, precisely shaped stone blades designed to be set into wooden or bone handles, creating composite tools of remarkable efficiency. Like the Eterians, the Zargians existed at a transitional moment in human history. The Ice Age was ending. Climates were shifting. The resources that had sustained nomadic lifestyles for millennia were changing distribution and abundance. Some Zargian groups responded by intensifying their exploitation of wild plants, leading eventually to the development of agriculture. Others apparently chose different paths, perhaps becoming specialized hunter-gatherers who thrived in mountain refugia even as lowland regions filled with farmers. But here is the speculative leap. What if some Zargian or Eterian populations did not simply adapt or migrate? What if they flourished, briefly, building societies complex enough to deserve the label civilization by any meaningful standard, and then, for reasons we cannot determine, chose to disperse again? Or were forced to by environmental pressures we haven't yet identified? Imagine a city in a mountain valley built during a brief window of climatic stability. Stone foundations, yes, but superstructures of timber and thatch. granaries filled with wild emmer and barley, workshops producing obsidian blades for trade, elders who memorized star patterns and seasonal cycles. And then, over the course of a few generations, the rains fail, springs dry up, game migrates. The city empties, not in panic, but in procession, families departing with what they can carry, leaving behind only the heaviest stones. Centuries later, erosion claims the timber. Floods bury the foundations. Landslides scatter the granaries. And the entire episode vanishes from history, detectable only as a faint anomaly in pollen cores or a clustering of radiocarbon dates that suggests unusual population density, followed by abandonment. This is not proven. It may never be proven. But the silence of the archaeological record is not proof of absence. It is merely silence, and silence, as any musician knows, is as much a part of the composition as sound. For most of human history, the idea of a permanent home would have seemed strange. Why stay in one place when resources are seasonal, when water moves, when the herds migrate? To follow the rains was not a failure of civilization, but a mastery of adaptation, a way of life, so successful that it persisted for tens of thousands of years. These were not aimless wanderers. They were expert geographers, carrying in their minds detailed maps of waterholes, seasonal grasses, fruit-bearing trees, and animal migration routes. They knew which valleys flooded first after the rains, which hillsides would green with new growth, which caves offered shelter from storms. This knowledge was precise, accumulated over generations, and passed down through oral traditions and direct teaching. When the African humid period began to wane around 5,500 years ago, the people of the Sahara faced a choice: stay and struggle as the land dried, or follow the rain southward. Most chose to move. The migration was not sudden. It unfolded over centuries, wave after wave of pastoral groups drifting toward regions that still received reliable monsoons. They brought with them cattle, sheep, and goats, domesticated species, that transformed the societies they encountered in sub-Saharan Africa. They brought pottery styles, tool technologies, and oral traditions. And they brought, almost certainly, memories. Stories of the green lands they had left behind, of lakes that no longer existed, of ancestors buried beneath sands that now covered everything. Some groups moved east instead, toward the Nile Valley. Here, the river provided a lifeline, a permanent source of water, even as surrounding landscapes turned to dust. The Nile's annual floods, driven by monsoons far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands, created a ribbon of fertility through an increasingly arid land. Populations concentrated along its banks, and from this concentration emerged the complex hierarchies that would eventually become pharaonic Egypt. But not everyone settled. Some groups continued the old ways, moving with the seasons, following rains that still fell in the highlands and along the Mediterranean coast. These were the Berber and Tuareg ancestors, peoples who adapted pastoralism to the new desert environment, finding ways to survive in landscapes that would kill the unprepared. Their architecture was temporary, tents of woven goat hair, lightweight and portable. Their tools were few but versatile: knives, bowls, water skins, everything designed to be carried. They marked their routes with cairns and rock art, messages to themselves and to others. Water here in spring, pasture good after rains, sacred place, approach with respect. This way of life continued, remarkably, into the modern era. Even as empires rose and fell along the Nile and the Mediterranean, even as Islam spread across North Africa, and trans-Saharan trade routes funneled gold and slaves to distant markets, the people who followed the rains persisted. They were there when Herodotus wrote his histories. They were there when Arab geographers mapped the desert. They are still there today, though their numbers dwindle and their traditions face erasure by climate change, political borders, and the relentless push for sedentary modernity. To follow the rains is to live without archives, without monuments, without the weight of history pressing down on every decision. It is to exist in a perpetual present, guided by knowledge so deep it feels like instinct. And when these people finally do settle, finally choose permanence over movement, something is lost. Not just a way of life, but a way of knowing our relationship with landscape and climate that sedentary peoples, ourselves included, can barely imagine. Rivers are the original highways. Long before humans paved roads or laid rail, waterways offered the easiest paths through wilderness. They provided transportation, yes, but also food, water, and navigation. To follow a river was to follow abundance. In the Green Sahara, rivers were everywhere. Not small streams, but substantial watercourses, some of them comparable to the modern Niger or Senegal. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have revealed their former paths. Ancient channels buried beneath sand, detectable only by subtle changes in surface texture or mineral composition. One of these ghost rivers, the Tamanrasset, once flowed north through the central Sahara, draining a vast watershed that stretched from the Ahagar Mountains to the Mediterranean coast. During humid periods, it would have been a major feature of the landscape hundreds of kilometers long, supporting gallery forests and wetlands along its banks. Another, the Wadi Hawar, flowed from the mountains of Darfur westward toward Lake Chad. Archaeologists have found extensive evidence of human occupation along its course: pottery, grinding stones, and even the remains of livestock enclosures. These were not temporary camps, but semi-permanent villages, built to take advantage of the river's bounty. Fish bones from Nile perch and catfish indicate that the river supported substantial fisheries. Pollen analysis shows that the surrounding vegetation included trees now found only in tropical savannas far to the south. And then, gradually, the rivers dried. Monsoons weakened. Rainfall declined. The rivers shrank year by year until they became seasonal streams, then chains of isolated pools, and finally, dust-filled valleys indistinguishable from the surrounding desert. For the people living along these rivers, the change would have been devastating. Imagine, your ancestors have lived in the same valley for 100 generations. You know every bend of the river, every good fishing spot, every grove where fruit trees grow thick. And then, slowly at first, but with terrible inevitability, the water begins to fail. One year, the flood is unusually low. Elders reassure the community. It has happened before. The rains will return. But the next year is worse. And the year after that. Springs that once flowed year-round now dry up in summer. Fish populations crash. Trees wither and die. Game moves away in search of water. You have choices. Move upstream, hoping that water still flows in the highlands. Move downstream, following the shrinking river toward its terminus, a lake that is also shrinking. Or abandon the river entirely, strike out across unfamiliar land in search of new water sources. Each choice is a gamble. Each choice means leaving behind ancestors' graves, sacred sites, the places that define your identity. Some communities fragmented. Extended families split apart, each group pursuing its own survival strategy. Others migrated as intact units, carrying with them their social structures and traditions. And some, perhaps, stayed too long, clinging to hope, to memory, to the belief that the river would return. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. They died beside dry channels, their bones eventually buried by the advancing sand. The rivers themselves became legends. Stories of water where now there is none, of fish and reeds and shade trees, of ancestors who lived in paradise before the world changed. In some oral traditions preserved among Saharan peoples, these legends persist. Tales of cities beneath the dunes of waters that will return when the world is renewed, of roads that once connected distant lands and will someday be walked again. The dry channels remain, visible from orbit, but invisible to anyone standing on the ground. Roads that lead nowhere, carrying no water, sheltering no life, but roads nonetheless waiting, patient, for the climate to shift again and the rains to return. In the Egyptian Sahara, about 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, there is a place called Nabta Playa. Once a seasonal lake fed by monsoon rains, it is now a barren basin littered with stones. But these are not ordinary stones. They are arranged, deliberately, precisely, in patterns that reveal knowledge we did not expect prehistoric peoples to possess. The site dates to around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, placing it in the late Green Sahara period. At that time, Nabta Playa would have been a vital resource, a large, shallow lake surrounded by grasslands, attracting both wildlife and human populations. People gathered here seasonally, perhaps for centuries, following herds and harvesting wild grains. At some point, they began to build, not dwellings or fortifications, but something else: stone circles. Arrangements of upright slabs, some of them over 2 meters tall, positioned with clear intentionality. And when researchers analyzed the alignments, they found something astonishing. The stones mark astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, the rising points of specific stars. The arrangements show knowledge of celestial mechanics that predates Stonehenge. That rivals the astronomical achievements of Bronze Age Mediterranean cultures. That suggests a sophistication of thought utterly incongruous with the label nomadic pastoralists. How did they do it? And more importantly, why? Tracking solstices and equinoxes has obvious practical value. It allows you to predict seasonal changes, to anticipate the arrival of rains, to organize social events around predictable celestial markers. But the precision at Nabta Playa goes beyond practical need. Some alignments track stars that would have been visible only briefly on the horizon, their rising or setting obscured by the glow of dawn or dusk. Observing these alignments would require not just casual sky watching, but dedicated, multi-generational effort. This suggests ritual significance. The stones were not just calendars, but ceremonial centers, places where people gathered to mark the turning of the year, to honor celestial deities, or to perform rites we can only speculate about. Perhaps they were pilgrimage sites, drawing visitors from across the Green Sahara. Perhaps they were schools, places where elder astronomers taught younger generations to read the sky. Beneath some of the stone circles, archaeologists have found something even stranger: carved rock sculptures. Megalithic cows, abstract representations of cattle, worked from bedrock and positioned beneath the circles as if buried intentionally. The effort required to create these sculptures is immense weeks or months of labor per piece. Yet they were hidden, placed underground, invisible to anyone standing above. Were they offerings, foundations, symbolic anchors connecting the earthly and the celestial? We do not know. The people who built Nabta Playa left no writing, no explanatory myths in forms we can access. They spoke their knowledge into the wind, and the wind carried it away. Today, the site is protected but rarely visited. The stones stand silent beneath the brutal sun, markers of a time when this desert was green, and humans looked up at the stars and wondered, and somehow, impossibly, found answers written in the sky. The ancients called it Arabia Felix, fortunate Arabia, not because it was wealthy, though it was, but because it was green. Rivers flowed from highlands swollen with monsoon rains. Frankincense trees grew thick on terraced hillsides. Fields of sorghum and millet waved under clouds that actually delivered water, instead of taunting the thirsty land with empty promises. This was the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, the region now known as Yemen and Oman lands that today are synonymous with aridity, conflict, and hardship. But for much of the Holocene, especially during the early and mid-periods, this region was comparatively lush. The monsoons that greened the Sahara also reached Arabia, though less intensely. Still, it was enough. Enough to support agriculture. Enough to sustain cities. enough to build kingdoms whose wealth derived from controlling trade routes that funneled incense, myrrh, and spices from Africa and India toward Mediterranean markets. But Arabia Felix's prosperity was not solely a product of classical antiquity. Long before the Sabaeans and Himyarites built their famous dams and temples, the highlands of Yemen and Oman were inhabited by peoples whose origins are murky and whose fate is uncertain. Archaeological surveys have revealed extensive terracing systems, some of which date to periods far earlier than previously assumed. These terraces retaining walls, built across hillsides to create flat planting surfaces and capture runoff, represent enormous investments of labor. They require maintenance, coordination, and social organization. They are not the work of scattered pastoralists, but of communities committed to permanence. Who built them? When? And what happened to them when the climate shifted and the rains began to fail? The mainstream narrative places the rise of complex societies in Arabia around 3,000 years ago, roughly coinciding with the emergence of the incense trade and the construction of monumental architecture like the Temple of Baron in Marib. But the terraces and the pottery found near them suggest earlier experiments with Satantism communities that settled, built, and then, for reasons unknown, either vanished or transformed into something else. One possibility is that these proto-kingdoms never reached the scale necessary to leave monumental ruins. They were small, perhaps no more than a few hundred people, organized around valleys where water was reliable. They farmed, traded with coastal fishing communities, and lived lives of relative stability until the climate turned against them. Another possibility, more speculative, is that some of these communities deliberately rejected monumental architecture. They built not in stone but in mud brick, timber, and thatch materials that returned quickly to the earth. They valued impermanence, perhaps for philosophical or religious reasons, and their greatest monuments or oral traditions, songs and poems passed down through generations until the communities dispersed and the traditions faded into silence. There are hints, too, of connections between Arabia and distant lands. Pottery styles that resemble those from the Horn of Africa, stone tools that match assemblages from the Persian Gulf, even hints, controversial but persistent, of pre-dynastic contact between Arabian cultures and Mesopotamia trade networks that predated writing, facilitated by coastal sailing and caravan routes that followed wadis during the wet season. If these connections existed, they would have made Arabia Felix not just a regional power, but a crossroads place where African, Asian, and Near Eastern influences mingled, creating hybrid cultures that were, in their time, centers of innovation. But when the rains failed gradually, inexorably, these networks collapsed. Villages that depended on seasonal streams found their water sources drying up. Terraces that once grew barley and wheat turned to dust. People migrated coastward, toward oases, toward places where water still flowed. And the highlands, once green and populous, returned to silence. Today, hikers in the Yemeni highlands occasionally stumble upon ancient terraces, weathered but still visible, climbing hillsides like ghost staircases. They find grinding stones, potsherds, sometimes even the remains of stone-lined wells that once tapped into aquifers long since depleted. These are the footprints of Arabia Felix, of the quiet kingdoms that flourished when the world was wetter and vanished when it was not. When the Ice Age ended, the sea did not rise gently. It surged, pulsed, and flooded, sometimes slowly, sometimes catastrophically. Over the course of 10,000 years, global sea levels rose by roughly 120 meters, inundating coastlines and drowning river valleys in a slow-motion apocalypse that reshaped the world's geography. The scale of loss is almost incomprehensible. Entire continental shelves vanished beneath the waves. The land bridge between Asia and Australia, known as Sunda, disappeared, leaving behind only islands, the Indonesian archipelago. The connection between Britain and Europe was severed, creating the English Channel, The Black Sea, once a freshwater lake, was breached by the Mediterranean in a flood so sudden and violent that it may have inspired the biblical deluge myths. And wherever there was coastline, there were people. Humans have always been drawn to shores. Coasts offer abundant resources: fish, shellfish, seaweed, seabirds. They provide access to maritime trade routes. They offer moderate climates, cooled by sea breezes in summer and warmed by ocean currents in winter. For most of human history, coastlines were the prime real estate, the places where populations were densest, where cultures were most complex, where innovation flourished. And now those coastlines are gone. Submerged, buried beneath tens of meters of sediment, covered by coral reefs and kelp forests, erased so completely that we forget they existed. But occasionally, something survives. A stone structure too heavy to be scattered by currents. A pottery cache wedged into a crevice. A submerged cave with walls painted by artists who lived when the cave opened onto dry land. In the Mediterranean, off the coast of Greece, divers have found submerged villages dating to the early Neolithic stone foundations for houses, streets, even what appear to be communal buildings. The sites are shallow enough to explore with basic scuba gear, and shallow enough that they were clearly built on dry land. Sea level rise claimed them incrementally, and eventually the inhabitants retreated inland, abandoning their homes to the waves. In the Persian Gulf, similar discoveries abound. The Gulf is shallow, rarely more than 50 meters deep, and during the Ice Age, it was almost entirely dry a river valley, lush and fertile, draining the Tigris and Euphrates southward toward the Indian Ocean. As sea levels rose, this valley flooded, and any settlements built along the ancient riverbanks are now underwater. Sonar surveys have revealed anomalies, geometric patterns on the seafloor, linear features that resemble roads or canals, circular formations that might be the remains of structures. Samples dredged from these sites have yielded tantalizing artifacts: worked flint, pottery fragments, even a stone anchor carved with symbols that predate known writing systems. Could this be evidence of a pre-Sumerian civilization, a culture that thrived in the Gulf Valley before the sea claimed it? The idea is controversial. The artifacts are few, and the sonar data is ambiguous. Nature can create geometric patterns too, and not every anomaly is human-made. But the possibility lingers, a ghost in the data, whispering that the origins of Mesopotamian civilization may lie not in the hills of Anatolia, but beneath the waves of the Gulf. In India, off the coast of Gujarat, the story repeats. Submerged structures in the Gulf of Cambay have been dated, tentatively, to periods that would make them older than any known Indian city. The findings are disputed, the dating methods questioned, but the structures themselves are real. They exist. And they raise the same uncomfortable question: what else is down there? The ocean is not a good preserver of archaeological sites. Salt water corrodes metal, weakens stone, and obliterates organic materials. Currents scatter debris. Marine organisms colonize structures, transforming them into reefs. But the ocean is vast, and we have explored only a tiny fraction of it. Every year brings new discoveries: a shipwreck, a submerged forest, an ancient landslide that reveals artifacts in its debris. Somewhere beneath the waves, in waters too deep or too murky to explore easily, there are cities. Not metaphorical cities, not mythical Atlantises, but real, prosaic human settlements, houses where children played, streets where merchants haggled, temples where priests sang to gods whose names we will never know. They are there, waiting, patient as stone, silent as the sea. The ocean is indifferent to human memory. It keeps no records, preserves no monuments, mourns no loss. When it rises, it simply rises, following the laws of thermodynamics and gravity, indifferent to what lies in its path. And yet, the ocean holds secrets, not intentionally, but inevitably. Every coastline swallowed is a library burned. Every village submerged is a chronicle lost. The post-ice age sea level rise was not the first such event, nor will it be the last. Earth's climate oscillates, driven by orbital cycles, solar variations, volcanic activity, and feedback loops within the atmosphere and oceans. Ice ages come and go, each one locking up vast quantities of water in glaciers, lowering sea levels, exposing continental shelves. And each interglacial period, like the one we are living in now, melts the ice, raises the seas, and drowns the coasts. This has happened dozens of times in the past million years. Dozens. Each cycle lasting tens of thousands of years, each one reshaping coastlines, each one potentially erasing entire civilizations from the record. We know of the most recent flood because it happened relatively recently, within the span of human civilization, and because some evidence survived on higher ground. But what about the floods before? The ones that occurred 150,000 years ago, or 300,000, or 500,000. If humans, or our hominin ancestors, built anything along those ancient coastlines, it is gone. Utterly, irrevocably gone. This is the ocean's cruelty. Not that it destroys, but that it does so without malice and without memory. The ocean does not care that it has erased 10,000 years of human history. It does not care that the most sophisticated cultures of the early Holocene may have lived on coasts that are now 120 meters underwater. It simply rises and falls, and rises again, following rhythms older than our species. And so we are left with fragments, hints, anomalies that suggest more than they prove. We dredge the seafloor and find worked stone. We run sonar surveys and see patterns that might be walls. We dive on submerged caves and find art painted when those caves were dry. Each discovery is tantalizing, but each is also incomplete, a single sentence from a book whose pages have dissolved. Imagine for a moment what we have lost, not in abstractions, but in specifics. Cities with names, peoples with languages, rituals performed in temples now colonized by coral, songs sung to the sea, which swallowed the singers. There were children who played on beaches now 40 meters underwater. There were elders who told stories, sitting beside fires that have long since been extinguished by the cold press of ocean. There were artists who carved shells, fishermen who knew the currents, priestesses who interpreted the flight of seabirds. All of them gone, not because they failed, not because they were conquered, but because the planet's climate shifted and the sea reclaimed land that had, for a brief geological moment, been dry. This is not a lament. It is simply a fact. The ocean erased its own stories, and we are left to wonder, staring out at the waves, what wonders lie beneath them, and whether we will ever find a way to read what the water has written. In the early 2000s, fishermen working off the coast of Mahabalipuram, India, began reporting strange sightings, large stone blocks on the sea floor. Walls, maybe? Structures too regular to be natural. Marine archaeologists investigated, and what they found was astonishing. The remains of a submerged temple complex, complete with carved pillars, foundation stones, and sculptures of animals and deities. The stones were worn smooth by centuries of tidal action, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. This was not a natural formation. It was human-made. Local legends had spoken of 7 pagodas, a group of temples that once stood on the shore near Mahabalipuram. According to the stories, 6 of them had been swallowed by the sea, leaving only one, the shore temple, still standing. The legends were dismissed as myth, the product of storytelling and exaggeration, until the fishermen found the stones. Subsequent surveys revealed that the submerged structures date to roughly the 7th or 8th century CE, aligning with the period when the shore temple was built. This was not a lost prehistoric civilization, but a well-documented medieval kingdom, the Pallavas, whose coastal temples had been claimed by rising sea levels and storm surges over the centuries. But the discovery raised a deeper question If medieval temples can be submerged and forgotten within 1,000 years, transformed from historical fact to local legend, what else might be down there? What other structures, older and deeper, lie beneath sediment and coral? The fishermen of Mahabalipuram had no agenda. They were not searching for lost cities or trying to prove theories. They were just trying to make a living, and they stumbled upon something extraordinary. Their discovery is a reminder that the ocean, secrets reveal themselves not according to our plans, but according to chance, a lucky glimpse, a shifted sandbar, a storm that scours away centuries of sediment. How many other fishermen, and how many other places, have seen stones on the seafloor and thought nothing of it? How many sunken wonders have been glimpsed and forgotten, dismissed as rocks or reefs, never investigated because no one realized what they were? The ocean is vast, our maps are incomplete, and the stories beneath the waves are waiting, patient as stone, for the next fisherman to glance down at the right moment and see, through the shifting blue, a shadow that does not belong. Long before writing, before agriculture, perhaps even before permanent settlements, humans were astronomers. Not professional scientists with telescopes and equations, but practical observers who needed to understand the sky in order to survive. The reasons are obvious. The sky is a calendar. The sun's daily arc determines when to wake and when to sleep. The moon's phases regulate tides and animal behavior. The stars wheel overhead in predictable patterns, marking the passage of seasons. To ignore the sky is to be lost in time, unable to plan, unable to anticipate the changes that mean life or death in a marginal environment. But early humans did more than passively observe. They measured, they marked. They built structures aligned to celestial events with precision that even today commands respect. Stonehenge is the most famous example, but it is far from unique. Across Europe, megalithic structures aligned to solstices, equinoxes, and lunar cycles. In the Americas, ancient observatories track the sun and Venus. In Asia, stone circles and earthworks mark significant celestial points. And in Africa, thousands of years before Stonehenge, the people of Nabta Playa were doing the same thing. Why? The standard explanation is agricultural. Farmers need to know when to plant and harvest. But this explanation falls apart in the face of evidence. Many of these structures predate agriculture. They were built by hunter-gatherers, by pastoralists, by people whose survival did not depend on precise planting schedules. So what were they tracking? And why invest so much labor in doing so? One possibility is that celestial events held deep spiritual significance. The solstice sunrise was not just a marker of the year's turning, but a sacred moment, a breach in the boundary between earthly and divine. To witness it from a specially prepared site, a stone circle, a chambered tomb, a hillside carved with spiral petroglyphs, was to participate in cosmic order. Another possibility is more practical. These structures were teaching tools. Observing the sky casually, you can learn some patterns. But to truly understand the celestial mechanics, to predict eclipses, to track the precession of equinoxes, to distinguish planets from stars, requires systematic observation over decades, even centuries. Stone markers make that observation possible. They anchor knowledge in the landscape, turning the sky into a legible text that can be read by anyone who knows the code. But there is a third possibility, rarely discussed, that some of these monuments represent lost knowledge, traditions that reached heights of sophistication and then collapsed, leaving behind only the stones. Consider the alignments at Nabta Playa. They track not just the sun, but specific stars whose rising or setting on the horizon would have been barely visible, obscured by the glow of dawn or dusk. Observing these requires not just patience, but advanced techniques, sighting tools, perhaps, or methods of calculation we can only guess at. Did the builders of Nabta Playa possess mathematical concepts, geometry, perhaps even trigonometry, that we assume were invented millennia later by the Greeks? Did they understand the mechanics of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that shifts the positions of stars over thousands of years? We do not know. The stones are silent, and the people who placed them left no written records, no diagrams, no explanations. Their knowledge was oral, or perhaps encoded in ways we do not recognize. And when their culture dispersed, when the lake dried and the stones were abandoned, that knowledge dispersed with them. Today, we rediscover these alignments using computers, satellite data, and archaeological surveys. We marvel at the precision, speculate about the methods, and quietly wonder, what else did they know? What other insights into the cosmos, into time, into the nature of existence itself, have been lost? The sky is still there, wheeling overhead, indifferent to our ignorance. The patterns persist, as they have for billions of years. But the people who once read those patterns with clarity and purpose, who built stone monuments to capture sunlight at the perfect moment, who sang the names of stars now forgotten, they are gone. And the sky clocks they left behind stand as monuments not just to their knowledge, but to the fragility of human wisdom. A shadow is a simple thing, the absence of light cast by an object blocking the sun. But to an ancient observer, a shadow was a tool, a way to measure time, track seasons, and connect the rhythms of earth to the rhythms of sky. The principle is straightforward. As the sun moves across the sky, shadows change length and direction. At noon, when the sun is highest, shadows are shortest. At dawn and dusk, they stretch long across the ground. By marking these changes, you can create a calendar, a way to measure the passing of days, months, and years. The gnomon of vertical pole or stone used to cast a shadow is one of humanity's oldest inventions. Examples have been found on every inhabited continent in cultures separated by thousands of years and thousands of kilometers. Some are crude, a stick pushed into the ground, its shadow measured with pebbles. Others are sophisticated, stone pillars carved with markers, positioned with astronomical precision, designed to track not just the sun, but the moon and stars as well. In Egypt, gnomons were used to orient temples and tombs, ensuring that sacred architecture aligned with celestial events. In Mesopotamia, shadow clocks divided the day into units, allowing priests to schedule rituals with precision. In China, gnomon measurements contributed to the development of calendar systems that rival any in the ancient world. But the use of shadows for timekeeping extends far beyond these well-documented civilizations. In Africa, across the Sahara and the savannas, stone markers aligned to cast shadows at specific times of year have been found at sites where no written records exist. In Arabia, pre-Islamic tribes are known to have used shadow measurements to determine prayer times and organize seasonal migrations. In the Pacific, navigators used the shadows of stars on the horizon to determine latitude, a technique that allowed them to cross vast ocean distances with astonishing accuracy. What unites these practices is not a shared culture or language, but a shared realization. That time is not formless, but structured, that the universe operates according to patterns, and that those patterns can be read by anyone willing to watch and measure. To measure time with shadows requires patience. You must observe, day after day, marking the changes, noticing the patterns. And you must pass this knowledge on, teaching the next generation to read the signs, to understand the calendar written in light and stone. This is why shadow clocks are often found at ceremonial sites. They were not just tools, but teachers, physical embodiments of knowledge that could be experienced directly. To stand beside a gnomon at the solstice, to watch the shadow reach its shortest point at noon, to witness the sun align perfectly with markers placed by ancestors, this was education in its deepest sense. Not the transfer of abstract information, but the direct experience of cosmic order. And when a culture dispersed, when its people moved on or transformed, the gnomons remained, silent, casting shadows that no one measured, marking time for an audience that no longer understood the language of the markers. Today, archaeologists find these structures and reconstruct their purpose. We use computers to model the sun's path, to calculate alignments, to verify that yes, this stone would have cast a shadow precisely here at the winter solstice. We rediscover, laboriously, what ancient observers knew intuitively, that the sun is reliable, that the sky is a calendar, and that time can be measured in the simple dance of light and shadow. But we also recognize what is lost, the rituals performed at these sites, the songs sung to mark the solstice, the names of the astronomers who first placed the stones and taught their children to read them. All of this is gone, leaving only the markers and the shadows they still cast, even now, even without an audience to understand them. Precision is not a modern invention. The ability to measure, to calculate, to fit stone to stone with minimal gaps, these are skills as old as civilization itself. What surprises us, sometimes uncomfortably, is how early these skills appear. Sites like Göbekli Tepe feature stones weighing 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs, fitted into sockets carved from bedrock. The precision is remarkable. The effort required is staggering. And the date 11,000 years ago is, according to conventional timelines, far too early for such sophistication. We can catalog the skills on display: quarrying, transportation, carving, lifting, alignment. Each requires not just labor, but knowledge-accumulated wisdom about materials, tools, leverage, and coordination. And yet the people who built Göbekli Tepe supposedly had no metallurgy, no written language, no wheel, no draft animals. They were, in the language of older textbooks, primitive. The word sits uneasily now, because the structures are not primitive. They are sophisticated, ambitious, and most troubling and inexplicable within the framework we've constructed. Similar examples abound. In Egypt, the Assyrian at Abydos features massive granite blocks fitted together with tolerances measured in millimeters. In Peru, the walls of Sacsayhuaman display stonework so precise that blades cannot be inserted between stones. In Lebanon, the trilithon stones of Baalbek weigh over 800 tons, each among the largest worked stones in the world, and no one is entirely certain how they were moved. The mainstream explanation emphasizes time, labor, and ingenuity. Given enough workers and enough determination, humans can accomplish astonishing things. Ropes, ramps, levers, and rollers, simple tools, yes, but effective when applied on a massive scale. This explanation is reasonable. It is probably correct. But it leaves a residue of unease, a sense that something is missing. Because precision is not just about effort. It is about technique. And technique is knowledge-specific, teachable, improvable knowledge. Where did this knowledge come from? How was it developed? And why, in many cases, does it seem to appear suddenly without obvious precursors? One possibility, rarely voiced in academic settings but persistent in alternative literature, is that these builders inherited techniques from earlier cultures. That the precision we see in stone was not invented in the Neolithic, but refined, adapted from older traditions now lost. This is speculation, and it should be treated as such. But it is not baseless speculation. We know that sea level rise erased coastlines where populations were dense. We know that climate change forced migrations, disrupting societies and scattering knowledge. We know that oral traditions can preserve technical information across generations, but also that oral traditions are fragile, vulnerable to disruption. If there were earlier engineers specialists in stone, in measurement, in construction, whose work was centered on now submerged coasts or now desertified regions, their legacy would be scattered. Fragments of technique, passed down through apprenticeships, might survive even as the broader cultural context vanished. And when new societies arose, they might build on these inherited skills without fully understanding their origins. This is not a claim of lost super civilizations or ancient aliens. It is simply the acknowledgement that human history is longer and more complex than the neat timelines in textbooks suggest. That knowledge can persist even when cultures collapse. That techniques can be refined over millennia, reaching heights of precision that seem, to later observers, almost miraculous. The vanished engineers of prehistory left no blueprints, no treatises, no signed masterpieces. They left only the stones precisely cut, impossibly heavy, aligned with celestial events in ways that suggest deep understanding. And those stones ask, quietly but persistently, what else did they know? And what have we forgotten? In a museum in Cairo, there is a small, unassuming object. A stone bowl carved from diorite, a hard, dense volcanic rock that resists abrasion and requires specialized tools to shape. The bowl is roughly 30 centimeters in diameter, shallow, with walls less than a centimeter thick. Its surface is polished to a mirror finish. And when engineers examined it with modern precision instruments, they found something astonishing. The walls are uniform in thickness to within a fraction of a millimeter. The symmetry is nearly perfect. The surface flatness rivals what can be achieved with machine tools. The bowl is dated to pre-dynastic Egypt, roughly 3,500 BC, before the pyramids, before hieroglyphic writing, before bronze tools were common. How was it made? The standard explanation involves copper tools, abrasive sand, and enormous patience. Copper, even without alloying, can abrade hard stone if used with sand as an intermediary. Skilled craftsmen, working over weeks or months, could theoretically hollow out the bowl using drills and handheld grinders, checking symmetry by eye and feel. But when modern stone carvers attempt to replicate the bowl using reconstructed ancient tools, they encounter problems. Diorite is difficult to work. Copper drills wear out quickly. Achieving uniformity in wall thickness, especially in such a thin-walled object, requires constant measurement, and pre-dynastic Egypt supposedly lacked precision measuring instruments. This does not mean the bowl is a hoax or the product of anachronistic technology or evidence of lost civilizations. It means that the craftsmen who made it possessed skills that we do not fully understand. They knew something about materials, about technique, about the properties of stone that has not been adequately preserved in the archaeological record. The bowl is not unique. Egyptian museums contain thousands of stone vessels from the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, many of them carved from hard stones, many displaying levels of precision that challenge replication. And diorite bowls are just one example. Across the ancient world, Peru, China, Anatolia, there are objects whose manufacture remains partially mysterious. These are not grand monuments. They are small, portable, often mundane in function. A bowl, a vase, a tool. But their precision whispers of knowledge systems more sophisticated than we expect, of techniques passed down through generations of specialists, of traditions that valued perfection for its own sake. The stone bowl in Cairo sits behind glass, labeled with a catalog number and a date. Visitors pass by without pausing, unaware that the object they're ignoring represents a mystery. Not a sensational mystery, no conspiracy, no hidden history, but a quiet puzzle. A question about what humans knew, how they learned it, and how much of that learning has been lost to time. There is a moment difficult to pinpoint when history stops being a record and becomes a story. When specific events, names, dates, places dissolve into generalities. When the Great Flood replaces the flood of the 12th year of King So and So's reign. When myth replaces chronicle. This transformation is inevitable for any culture without writing. Oral traditions are powerful. They can preserve knowledge for centuries, sometimes millennia, but they are also fluid. Each retelling is a reinterpretation. Details shift, events compress, chronology blurs. Over time, history becomes legend, and legend becomes myth, a story still told, but no longer believed in the same literal way. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood myth. So does Genesis. So do the oral traditions of dozens of cultures worldwide. Are these stories memories of real events, catastrophic floods caused by sea level rise, glacial lake outbursts, or river delta collapses? Or are they simply universal metaphors, narratives that cultures generate independently because flooding is a common enough disaster that it becomes archetypal? The answer, frustratingly, is probably both. Some flood myths likely preserve dim memories of real catastrophes. The Black Sea flood hypothesis, for instance, proposes that the Mediterranean breached a land barrier around 5,600 BCE, flooding the Black Sea basin and displacing Neolithic farming communities. The event would have been traumatic, a wall of water advancing inland, drowning fields and villages, forcing survivors to flee. Such an event would be remembered, told, and retold, transforming over generations into myth. But other flood myths are clearly symbolic, their details too fantastic, their chronology too vague to represent real events. They function as stories about chaos and renewal, about divine judgment, about the fragility of civilization. To insist that every myth must have a historical kernel is to misunderstand how storytelling works. What we lose when history becomes myth is specificity. The names of heroes are replaced by archetypes. Specific battles become generalized wars. Complex political conflicts reduced to simple binaries. Good versus evil, us versus them, order versus chaos. And when memory becomes myth, entire civilizations can vanish. Not physically, their ruins might persist, but narratively. They cease to exist as historical actors and become props in later people's stories. The builders of Göbekli Tepe are forgotten, their monuments reinterpreted as natural formations or attributed to later cultures. The mariners of the desert seas become jinn, spirits haunting the dunes. The astronomers of Nabta Playa become legendary sorcerers who commanded the stars. This process is not malicious. It is simply how memory works across deep time. Without writing to anchor events, without archives to preserve specifics, history dissolves. What remains are patterns: the flood, the conquest, the golden age, the collapse. And these patterns, repeated in story after story, culture after culture, become the bedrock of mythology. No longer history, but something deeper, more symbolic, more universal. Yet occasionally, archaeology resurrects what mythology has obscured. A site is excavated, artifacts analyzed, dates assigned, and a myth suddenly gains historical weight. The Trojan War, long dismissed as pure fiction, was revealed to have a historical core when Schliemann excavated his Ark. The Palace of Knossos, home to the Minotaur's labyrinth in Greek legend, proved to be a real Bronze Age complex, astonishing in its complexity. How many other myths await similar resurrection? How many stories dismissed as fanciful tales of lost cities, vanished kingdoms, golden ages are actually compressed, distorted memories of real places and real peoples? We cannot know until we dig. Until we search the places myth points us toward and find, or fail to find, the evidence. Until we learn to read mythology not as falsehood, but as memory-transformed history, seen through the distorting lens of generations, blurred but not entirely erased. Not every civilization ends in fire. Some do, of course, conquered by invaders, consumed by rebellion, obliterated by natural disasters too sudden to escape. But others simply fade. Their people disperse, their cities empty, their traditions transform into something unrecognizable. There is no apocalypse. Just a slow letting go, like breath released at the end of a long day. This is the truth whispered by the vanished civilizations we have explored, that endings need not be violent, that a society can be profoundly complex, deeply knowledgeable, and still choose or be compelled to become something else. The people of the Green Sahara did not die when the rains failed. They migrated, adapted, merged with other groups. Their culture persisted, not intact but transformed, in the societies that rose along the Nile, in the Sahel, in the distant highlands they reached after generations of travel. They are not lost. They are diffused, their legacy scattered across Africa like seeds on the wind. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not vanish when they buried their temple. They moved on, perhaps to new sites, new experiments in permanence. Their knowledge of stone and sky passed into other hands, refined and adapted by successor cultures that built their own monuments and eventually, centuries later, developed agriculture, writing, and the familiar architecture of Bronze Age civilizations. The mariners of the desert seas became the herders of the Sahara, navigating dunes instead of water, following the rains instead of rivers. Their boats rotted away, but their descendants survived, carrying forward stories and techniques that still echo in the oral traditions of Saharan peoples. This is not tragedy, it is transformation. The natural rhythm of human societies, which have always been in motion, always adapting, always becoming something new in response to changing worlds. We mourn these vanished civilizations because we see them through the lens of our own anxieties. We fear impermanence. We build in steel and concrete, inscribe our achievements in digital archives, hoping to be remembered millennia hence. But the peoples we have explored here did not share that anxiety. They built what was needed when it was needed. And when the need passed, they moved on. There is serenity in that. A kind of wisdom that we, in our relentless pursuit of permanence, might consider. Imagine standing at Nabta Playa, beneath the stone circles, as the last rains fell. Imagine knowing that the lake would not return, that the grasslands were dying, that your people would have to leave. And imagine accepting that. Not in despair, but in understanding. The world changes. We change with it. The stones will remain, marking what we knew, where we stood, when we watched the stars wheel overhead and understood briefly our place in the turning of time. And then imagine walking away, not looking back, carrying only what you can hold, tools, children, stories, leaving the stones to the wind and the sand, confident that they will speak for you when you are gone. This is the gentle goodbye of civilizations, not an ending, but a departure. And perhaps, in some distant future when the climate shifts again and the rains return to the Sahara, new peoples will find those stones and wonder, and in wondering, keep the conversation alive. The vanished civilizations are not truly gone. They are woven into us, into the cumulative knowledge of our species, into the techniques and traditions we inherit without attribution. They are the foundation beneath our foundations, the forgotten ancestors whose innovations made our world possible. And when we, in our turn, fade as all civilizations eventually must, we will join them, not lost but transformed, not erased but dispersed. Another layer in the deep history of humanity, waiting to be rediscovered by whoever comes next.